Hi there, Will here, and today I have a question. My mate David recently got this Fuji X100VI, and I figured I'd quite like to see how closely this thing's film presets can match real film. So I've got my Nikon F3 here. We're going to load some Colorplus into it and take some pictures around Stellenbosch.
It's fine with me.
Colorplus, the film of champions. The second part to this investigation, by the way, is that a company called Dehancer reached out to me and asked if I'd like to try their film presets. So what we're going to end up doing here, I reckon, is shooting the Fuji stuff with the built-in preset and shooting RAWs and seeing how the Fuji presets compare to Dehancer stuff as well. So there's a triple threat here. We get film versus Fuji preset versus Dehancer film profiles, I suppose. I think we're good. Let's get to it. So David has kindly supplied me with a 20mm for the F3 and the Fuji has a 23mm on it. We'll see how far we get trying to compare them directly like that, because this is a very wide lens, and where we are today is a giraffe sanctuary type deal, and I'm not sure I'm going to get close enough to any giraffes to actually be able to use a 20mm lens. Come on, stick your head up. Did it take the picture? I don't know if it took the picture. It took the picture. Wow, it didn't make a sound. That's weird. All right, we're gonna leave this spot now. I kind of thought it might be a sanctuary, to be honest. I didn't look into it properly, and it feels a bit more like a zoo. And I'm actually not particularly into zoos. It kind of feels a bit cagey, even though I suppose they do live quite a good life here. I don't know. It's just not really my vibe. I prefer seeing things in the wild. So we're going to cruise around and see if we can find some landscape pictures or something. I'm not familiar with the area, and neither is David, but maybe we'll find something interesting to look at that isn't a caged animal. These flowers are actually my worst nightmare. Hay fever season. Great success. We've stopped on the side of the road here because there's a very interesting wall moss situation type deal going on. Or maybe it's just paint, but worthy of a photograph, I reckon. We were getting a bit bored of the Cape Town scene, so we decided to hop on a quick flight and come check out this cool vintage car dealership thing. I'm hoping to make up for the year's worth of analog old car photos I haven't made, so we'll see if I can blast through about 50 of them here quick. The classic. Cool. Nice. It's actually the first good picture of the day. I'm a fan. I'm a large fan. Crazy. Crazy. Where's that 20mm? Oh, that's the end of the roll. Okay, well, we're gonna hang around here a bit more, and I'll probably shoot some more on David's Fuji, since might as well, maybe a couple RB snaps, but that is the end of this comparison. So join me at home for my thoughts.
We've actually got some pretty interesting things to look at here. The main reason I was interested in this at all when Dehancer reached out was because I recently went on a trip and made a around 500 images and realized just how laborious my process has the capacity to be when it comes to large project work. So when they reached out and they were like, we can make things look like film, I was like, well, if you can, then it'd save me a whole bunch of time going forward in terms of my process. So actually, I'm quite interested to see just how close I can make things match here. Dehancer has sponsored this video, but I'm under no obligation to say anything of any variety outside of trying it out, and I'd like to think that based on my track record for taking on sponsorships, that you know that there's no chance I'd lie to you about anything that I'm using. With regards to my ideology in grading these images, I figured the truest way to do it would be to match it to the raw lab scans, which I did myself on a Fuji Frontier SP3000. I didn't adjust for anything in the scanning process and just let the machine do what it wanted. That doesn't mean that it's a true raw film look and exactly how the film looks, because the scanner still has the capacity to interpret any image differently depending on the mood it's in. I promise. I've scanned many things many different ways on Frontiers, and it depends what they want to do on the day, really, what you end up with. So I just figured the plain scan look is the hardest thing to match digitally, and was interested to see if I could make a digital file look like a plain scan. To start off with, I'll walk you through the workflow I used with Dehancer and Photoshop to try get things matched. I opened the Fuji RAW in Photoshop, immediately popped the Dehancer filter on with film compression and film grain being the two main things I left on outside of the Colorplus profile. If you want to get techie with it, you can adjust all these other things with it too, but I was mainly interested in matching the files up as best I could, so I left the more creative things turned off. The Fuji recipe files I did nothing to besides adjust levels to balance out exposures, since I used auto exposure, and with the recipe applied, the images had a tendency to be a bit underexposed. I'm not sure why, because the RAWs weren't underexposed, it's just the recipe that sort of stops down a bit somehow, I suppose. And this is how things turned out. The order convention I'll be using is film shot, Fuji shot, Dehancer shot, RAW, and we'll compare and contrast from there. Film. As I mentioned, I scanned these on a Fuji Frontier, so they have the classic Frontier look, Fuji. The Fuji Colorplus recipe kind of just seems to add a bunch of contrast and saturation, as well as some sort of grain filter. I'd like to make it clear that this isn't a review of Fuji cameras, and I know for a fact one can get marvelous results out of them, hence why I was curious to try this camera. I'm just saying at a base level, this is what the recipe does without any tinkering in post. Dehancer. The Dehancer situation is a bit like magic to me when comparing it to the Fuji preset, since what the Fuji does is add filmic elements to a digital file, but what Dehancer seems to be doing is nuking all the digital out of a digi file and sort of magicking the film vibes onto it. This is most apparent at 100% zoom. If we look at this bus image, for example, the 100% on the Fuji is just a somewhat sharpened, maybe a bit grainier file. Compared to the film on the Frontier, it's very clear that things are a bunch more clinical optically, and this comes across in the look of the image as a whole too. The Dehancer frame zoomed into the grain is a lot closer to the rendering of the Frontier. It's still missing some of the intricacies of film rendering, mainly the combination of a washed out look whilst still having dark shadows in elements like the interior through the glass. But the grain is much truer to the real thing, as are the colors. That being said, of course, the colors are subjective and can be tweaked, but the overall rendering of the Dehancer emulation is much truer to the Frontier scan than the Fuji file. For the sake of curiosity, here's the raw Fuji file to compare what the software does as compared to the way that it's actually captured through the camera. And also for the sake of curiosity, this is what it looks like if you take the Fuji recipe image and add Dehancer's grain and film compression to it. Pretty interesting, eh? We end up with truer grain structure again, but the way Dehancer interprets color actually ends up matching the Frontier's interpretation a lot better than the Fuji recipe. Here's another frame, the one of the canola field. This is what the film scan looks like. The Fuji recipe, the Dehancer emulation, and the Fuji RAW. I'm actually kind of blown away by how close one can get with Dehancer some of the time, and I mean, I know in complimenting it and hearing myself say it, it sounds like I'm trying to plug it, but I'm not, because if it was terrible, I'd tell you it was terrible. And I say some of the time because in trickier lighting, film will do things that a digital camera is just technically too good to do. For example, with this car interior, the colors and feel are very filmy, really, in the Dehancer edit, but the amount of data in the Fuji RAW file means that the shadows don't have the same fall off as the actual Colorplus frame, and the detail there kind of gives it away. The highlights are also a little bit better in the Colorplus frame still, even with Dehancer's film compression applied. Couldn't tell you why, because I mean theoretically the digital camera has much better dynamic range, but you know, it's just the way that the film renders it that makes it look a bit less blown out, I guess. And this is really just scratching the surface of what the software can do. The coolest part of it, in my opinion, is the more creative things like bloom and halation, which give what I find to be a very reasonable interpretation of the effects that you can tweak to your liking too. Like if I weren't aiming to match the raw scans here and were trying to get things to look like a banging, retouched, Cinebloom filtered film scan, I reckon it'd be even harder to tell the difference on most of them, since you can hide a lot of the digital elements behind the retouching involved in bringing a film scan to life. It also simplifies a lot of elements involved in tweaking a digital file into things that sort of do a bunch of different jobs in one swoop view. Like the print element of the software, for example, allows you to tweak things like saturation in a much more toned down manner than just boosting vibrancy or saturation in Lightroom. To be honest, I think its most realistic use case is not using the actual film presets, but tweaking colors to a point where you like them in Photoshop, if you're more comfortable with that like I am, and then adding the oomph to it in Dehancer with some more creative elements. It's not an instant solution to having things look exactly like film, so long as you chuck filters on it, but I found the software to be surprisingly powerful, and if you know what you're doing already to some extent in post, then it's a super useful tool to be able to do things in a bit of a more clean way than Photoshop and struggling along would do. So the verdict, I suppose, would be that it does an excellent job if you're willing to take the time to make it do the job. It's definitely not just a one-stop solution though. Like as I say, you're going to have to put some work in to make things look nice. But in terms of things I've tried, and there are very few things I've tried besides using, you know, built-in Photoshop tools to make things look a bit more filmy, it's really quite surprising. I mean, it's up to personal preference really if you enjoy destroying the data that the raw file has, because in essence what you're doing when you chuck that grain filter on it is unsharpening it and making it more mushy to make it look like the film scan. But it's quite promising to me, and I mean you can tinker with all of these things, and I know I will be going forward. You know, maybe if I get to shoot a GFX again or a phase 1, having something like this on hand will be useful. They have an app as well that they asked me to mention. It's a pretty cool thing, I suppose. I mean, you can do the majority of the things that you can do on the desktop app on your iPhone. It's just, it costs the same as the desktop app, so I'm not really sure I'd ever want to go that route. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. I greatly look forward to showing you my road trip video in the near future. It's probably the greatest thing I've ever made, video-wise. I mean, now that it's coming together, I really get a feel for it, and I don't think I'll ever put anything out here that I'm going to be quite as proud of as that video. And now I get to make the video that was trash on the Insta360 and my iPhone look a bit better with Dehancer, I suppose. So thank you to them. Anyway, I'll see you soon.